Hello there, Sisyphus Redeemed. This is Dad as a Virtue. I just wanted to start off by saying I think your videos are insightful and well argued. I'm a huge fan. Uh, but I wanted to address what I felt were some weaknesses in your argument for apatheism, the idea that it simply doesn't matter one way or the other whether a God exists. Keep in mind, I do tend to lean towards apatheism myself, but I want to address what I felt were some flaws in the argument. Um, this video is being done sort of off the cuff, so I apologize if it's kind of rambly and unscripted and lots of stumbling over my words. So the first thing I felt needed to be addressed was your assertion that most people really just don't care, that even your average devout Christian doesn't really care because they get over it. That was the assertion. And this seems to me to be a really weak argument, because as you yourself have quite correctly pointed out in previous videos, human beings are incredibly resilient. They adapt, and incredibly significant things can happen in their lives, and their attitudes over time will tend to normalize. You yourself pointed out the example of a person being paralyzed from the waist down versus winning the lottery. You meet up with them again in a year or two's time, and their attitudes have normalized. They are back to the sort of their baseline level of contentment. You've also used the example of parents losing a child. They tend to get over that, and much quicker than you would expect. So that doesn't really prove that a person doesn't really care, whether or not God exists, because if they lost their belief, they would adjust, because they would adjust to any number of things they really do care about. The other problem, to me, it seems that you fail to clarify the scope of the argument. It seems to me that the conclusion that it just doesn't matter one way or the other whether God exists is not qualified properly. Namely, that it only applies in the empirical surroundings we find ourselves in currently. It doesn't show that the idea of God doesn't matter in principle. For instance, it's easy to imagine how significant the existence of a God really would be were one to exist. I mean, this is the God of the Old Testament who parted the Red Seas, who sent plagues to Egypt. Such a God, the question of such a God's existence would be absolutely crucial. The only reason it doesn't seem to matter is because we find ourselves in a world where all the empirical data seems to suggest that one actually does not exist. In other words, the very seeming lack of consequence of God's existence, according to your argument, is precisely because there is no reason to believe he exists. Richard Carrier at Skepticon 4 did a really just an awesome analysis of using Bayes' theorem to discuss religious ideas, and he pointed out that from a purely probabilistic stance, any ad hoc reason that a Christian might use to weasel out of an argument against the existence of God would necessarily decimate the actual probability of God's existence. That he used the example, for instance, of slavery versus the problem of evil, and the sort of excuses a Christian might give to weasel out of that. For instance, the free will defense, or the idea that God might for some reason have some valid reason for not speaking out against slavery, that completely decimates the probability that such a God actually exists, because it simply complicates that God and adds additional terms onto its existence. It's simply a matter of conditional probability. The probability of A is necessarily greater than or equal to the probability of A and B. So the more terms you add onto it, the more the more you're going to weaken the prior probability of that thing's existence. And so when you point out that people don't really care one way or another if God exists because there doesn't seem to be any real consequence, that's precisely because of the world we live in is one in which, for all intents and purposes, a God does not seem to exist. And so it seems historically this doesn't address, ancient cultures who weren't aware of the things we are today. So, for instance, if people really believed that the God could, send plagues and locusts, or he'd part the Red Sea for them, or he'd produce miracles, those things would absolutely be of consequence to society, of great consequence. That there was actually some omnipotent monarch controlling the universe. So there's a magistrate of existence. That absolutely, that seems like that would matter if it were actually the case. But it's not the case, or at least it doesn't seem to be. So I think at this point I've sort of made the points I was attempting to make, and I'm starting to repeat myself and ramble a little bit, so I think I'll wrap it up here. So to sum up, the argument that people don't really care because they'll get over it doesn't work, because they'll get over any number of things that they really do care about. And the argument that it doesn't matter because there's no real consequence in the world of whether God exists only applies because there's no evidence that a God does exist. So there's my critique. I hope you'll see some value in it. Yeah. Thanks for watching.